Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology. Today, I'm joined by Annika Lems, who is a research leader of an independent Max Planck group, Alpine Histories of Global Change, correct?
That's right.
Okay, welcome Annika to the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so today we're actually not going to talk about your current research, but rather this book here, Frontiers of Belonging, The Education of Unaccompanied Refugee Youth, which has just been published by Indiana University Press.
Yes, that's right.
Congratulations on the publication.
Thanks.
So maybe to begin with, you could tell me a little bit about the background of this book, exactly what it's about and how you came to study unaccompanied refugee youth in Switzerland, I take it.
Yeah. So the research that I undertook as part of this book project was part of a larger research project, which was based at the University of Bern. And it looked at the educational pathways of unaccompanied refugee youth in Switzerland and in Turkey. And so I was responsible for the research part in Switzerland. And so just to clarify who unaccompanied refugee youth are, because it's a clearly determined legal term as well. They are actually they are young asylum seekers who come to Switzerland or any other country in the world, really, unaccompanied by any adult or legal guardian. So they embark on very long journeys on their own, and in this case to Switzerland. And so the project basically followed their educational pathways. So as part of the project, I went into so-called integration classes, into education projects that were set up for unaccompanied minors. But I also followed them into the everyday pathways outside of the schools.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit about the people that you're working with? Where did they come from? What sort of stories did they have?
Yeah, the vast majority of the young people arriving in Switzerland at that point in time were from Eritrea. And basically, the vast majority were also male. So most of them were aged between 15 and 17 years old. And so the reason that a lot of the young Eritrean people left their country is also very closely related to educational questions. So in Eritrea, there has been a dictatorial regime for quite a long time now. And young people, when they turn around 16 years old, they are transferred through the school system into a military training program. And so the vast majority of the young people actually end up being recruited into the army. So this is not a choice, but it's basically decided for them. And so a lot of young people, to escape this military training and the compulsory military service, they leave the country before they turn 16 years old.
Okay.
And so a big group of them at that point in time went to Switzerland. And these were really the young people that I worked with mainly.
Okay. And you said that education played a big role in the kind of pathways that they took. So how was that the case?
So on the one hand, because they felt they were forced to leave because they couldn't go on in the educational system in Eritrea. So as I mentioned before, most of them, the vast majority of them, would end up in the compulsory military service, which goes on for extended amounts of time. Some people in Eritrea end up spending their whole life in the military. And a lot of the young people I worked with actually were dreaming of achieving something else. They wanted to go to university. They really wanted to have a better education. And so then the next step for them would be, for the most of them, to go to the neighboring country, which is Ethiopia, where many of them lived in refugee camps for several years. but then they also didn't get access to quality education there. And so then they started to think about other ways to achieve this. So they were quite savvy, a lot of the young people I worked with, and they did their research, and they found out through the internet and so on that Switzerland was supposed to have one of the best public education systems in the world. And so they embarked on quite dangerous journeys with the idea that they wanted to gain access to this kind of education.
Okay.
And of course, it's not that simple. There are always, it's always interwoven. These educational hopes and dreams are always interwoven as well with other pressures. So life in the refugee camps in Eritrea was not easy. Often there was a lack of food and obviously mass accommodation, and there was no way for them to become part of the local economy and get jobs. And of course, the other countries they traveled through, like Sudan and Libya, they are known for horrific human rights abuses towards refugees. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but education played a very important role in the young people's decision to leave and try to reach Europe and Switzerland particularly.
Okay. And your ethnography, of course, is about their experience when they arrived in Switzerland and
Yes.
how they actually experienced the sort of educational opportunities that they found there. So tell me something about that. Were they able to pursue their aspirations, or was it more complicated than that?
It was more complicated than that. So in the moment that they arrived in Switzerland and when my research took place, so I have to kind of complexify the whole situation a little bit, was a particular situation because it was 2015, the so-called refugee crisis, which many scholars now prefer to call the refugee reception crisis, had just started. So this means that there was an unprecedented number of refugees arriving in Europe, mainly from Syria and Afghanistan, but Eritrea was also a top kind of migration country, you could say, at this point of time. And basically, the figure of the unaccompanied minor played a very important role in the public debates at this moment. And there was a huge wave of compassion, really, towards the young people. And this led to the creation of educational opportunities in Switzerland, but also in other countries that hadn't been there for them before. So now I'm particularly talking about so-called integration classes that were set up in Switzerland, particularly for unaccompanied refugee youth that were still in the asylum-seeking process. So prior to 2015, young refugees who hadn't already received refugee status were denied access to education. And so this was a huge step forward in the one sense. But then when I started to attend these integration projects, I started to observe how these projects were not such a straightforward way of including young people in Swiss society, but they were actually more of an inclusionary front but actually a lot of exclusionary practices were taking part there.
And this is one term that you develop in the book, this notion of inclusive exclusion.
Yeah, that's right. So in collaboration with Katrin Oester, who has been working on refugee questions in Switzerland for a long time, and she was part of this project as a project leader. So together we developed this term inclusive exclusions or inclusive exclusion to kind of try and name the very ambiguous dynamics that were taking place on the ground.
And it sounds not only ambiguous, but also quite paradoxical, almost like a double bind situation by the sound of things. Could you sort of explain more, like concretely, what you're talking about when you're talking about inclusive exclusion?
Yeah, so it was very paradoxical, and sometimes it really takes ethnographic kind of depth and time, the time that you have to be in the place to even start seeing and unpacking these paradoxes. Basically what was happening was that a lot of the teachers that were working in these projects, they were they came from a background where they were very interested in working with refugee youth. So they were not closed off to the idea of refugees attending these classes. And yet in the school classes, they implemented a whole range of hurdles for the young people that made it impossible for them to ever exit these integration classes, which were only meant to be temporary. They were meant to help young refugees to learn the language, learn a little bit about the Swiss school system, to then be included in the mainstream schooling. But the longer I stayed in these classes, the more cases I observed of young people who actually spent extended amounts of time in these classes, even though they in my opinion, a lot of them qualified to be included in the mainstream schooling. And they often did so through the teachers, often did so by using kind of a very compassionate language of having in mind the best interest of the child, to protect the young people from getting disappointed if they ever went to mainstream schools and weren't good enough. But then there was always also the language of them not being sufficient enough in language, or not being good enough in their background to ever be included in the mainstream school system. And so this was very difficult for the young people as well to understand and to live with, because a lot of them had come into these classes full of hopes, but they subsequently saw them basically losing these opportunities and or not being able to grasp the opportunities that they had hoped for.
So just to understand correctly, like the teachers you're talking about placed hurdles in the way of the refugee youth. Was this something that they were intentionally doing to sort of stop their chances, but you talk about them using the language of compassion and protection? Do you feel like they were genuine in this, or was it a more cynical process?
No, I think they were genuine in this. I really believe, and I know it through my conversations with them, that they didn't often actually realize kind of the damage that they were doing, you could say, to use a very dramatic term. Often they also didn't have many other opportunities to change this system. And this is where I have to arch out and talk about the school system at large, which is known to be in the German-speaking world quite segregating from an early age. So young people are segregated from the early age of 11 in Switzerland, where some young people go into the more academic stream and the others into the more vocational stream. And it has its advantages. Vocational or apprenticeships are quite highly valued in these countries, and they're often also highly qualified. But it's also known to actually create strong segregations between, for example, working class and migrant youth, and children that come from a background where they have parents that already are more incentivizing them towards academic streams of learning.
Right.
And so this is kind of the system within which the teachers were operating, and that didn't give them many opportunities to actually strive for changes.
Okay, so it's a system in which this sort of mobility between different streams is already very difficult.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that your book contains like a number of life stories or sort of biographical sketches of some of these refugee youth. So I was wondering if maybe you could describe one of these to give us a more sort of tangible sense of what it was like for the people you worked with.
Yeah. Yes. So I could so basically the book contains, so every chapter dives into the life story of another youth. And one that might be particularly interesting to kind of exemplify this idea of inclusive exclusion is the story of Meron. He left his home country, Eritrea, when he was 15 years old. And he first spent a few months in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. And I should mention that he was a top student already in his school in Eritrea. But he knew that he wouldn't ever have a chance of going to university in Eritrea because his father had actually been detained for oppositional activities, and basically his family was on the blacklist, you could say. And so he decided that he would leave before having to go into military service, went to Ethiopia, where he stayed in the refugee camp for a bit, and then realized he couldn't go to school there either. And so, like a lot of the other youth, he researched his best options, and he decided to leave for Switzerland. And he traveled through Sudan and Libya and across the Mediterranean, and finally made his way to Switzerland in 2015, where he very quickly learned German, really in record time. I think he spoke already in a really high, sophisticated level of German after 1 year. And so basically he would have been a top candidate to make the jump from the integration classes into mainstream schooling. And it was also his aim. He really hoped to go to gymnasium, so that's secondary schooling, and to then make his way into university and study medicine.
Medicine, okay.
But he very quickly actually learned that this was impossible. So he learned it from the reactions of his teachers, who basically didn't react at all to his pleas to get more information on how he could move on and how he could access secondary education. And this shows that it's not just the teachers doing this, but that it's more of a systemic kind of problem. Because he was under the age of 18, he had a legal guardian, and so he approached his legal guardian, who by the definition of the term should actually work in his best interests. But the legal guardian really discouraged him and said that it would be very difficult, but he would talk to the teacher. And so talked to the teacher, and then a few days later, the teacher basically told him, "I heard that you really don't like my way of teaching. I'm just telling you that if you are not happy here, you can go. You're free to go and leave." But of course, the young people were not free to go and leave because they didn't have any other option. And so basically, from having learned this, he started to think about other options. And his next best option was to get an apprenticeship. Because I should say that the highest kind of goal that the teachers were trying to prepare the youth for was not a full apprenticeship, but a so-called refugee apprenticeship, which instead of 4 years only takes 2 years. And it usually just qualifies you for the lowest kind of levels of the job market. And he wanted to get into the higher stream of apprenticeships. And so he spent really the next whole year trying to convince his teacher by completely changing his personality and character when he was in class. So I could observe that while I was
you can
there.
say he was sort of performing a particular kind of self in order to...
Exactly. He would basically try and please the teacher, and so he would tone down on any kind of criticism, because he was actually quite a vocal character, naturally, I would say. So he was quite good in grasping situations where they encountered discrimination, but he's completely stopped voicing his ideas about this. He tried to always be seen as doing the right thing in front of his teacher, and basically doing everything that a model student would do. Because I met him also outside of school, and he was quite open about it, that he was doing this as a strategy. So he was really only doing this with this one goal in mind, you could say. But it came also at a high cost, obviously, personally, because it was, for him, he felt like he couldn't voice what he was really thinking, and the experiences that he made also within the Swiss asylum landscape. So But in the end of the day, he was successful in the sense that he was the only student out of the 40 students that I accompanied during that year who really got promoted to do an apprenticeship, a full apprenticeship. And he managed to finish it successfully, and he's quite happy and content in his job now.
Okay, the only one. And what kind of apprenticeship was it?
It was, I don't know exactly how you say it in English, but it was basically in a factory where they produce plastic packaging for medical equipment. So it's quite it was quite a demanding apprenticeship because it contained a lot of chemistry and physics and so on. So
Okay, right, but still a far cry from medicine.
a far cry from medicine. And when he reflects upon it now, he still feels quite dissatisfied with where he's at. And for example, he never told his parents what he's doing because he's ashamed of where he ended up being compared to what he said he was going to do in Europe when he was there. So yeah, and that's quite painful for him because it creates a huge distance between him and his parents back at home.
It sounds like in some ways quite a difficult research project, you know, a lot of stories that are probably quite hard to hear. But how do you feel like your insights as an anthropologist could perhaps, were there any sort of practical kind of insights that you could have that you think could influence policy or influence how teachers approach the classroom situation in these kinds of situations?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's a difficult question because I think there's been a lot of very good, pedagogical research that give teachers really clear-cut programs. So my research does not do this, but what it does do is actually look into depth. It really is able to show the complexities of these young people's life worlds, and it might help teachers who are interested in reading this to actually understand these complexities, because this is something that I realized while working in these classes, that the teachers really often actually approached me and asked me about the youth rather than them actually going and asking them things about their lives. So they often didn't know much, if anything at all, about their past, even though they were quite happy to talk about it. So it was not an unwillingness on the side of the students to talk about their experiences. I also think that exactly these kind of paradoxical situations that you mentioned in the beginning, that this is what ethnography can show. And this is something that is very difficult to show through purely kind of discourse analysis of educational texts or of statistical research. So you really have to delve into people's everyday lives to kind of grasp this. And I think that that this might not be a clear-cut educational policy program that comes out of it, but it might still inform people who are working on this. So yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, because it sounds like there's so much sort of implicit going on in the classroom situation that people themselves are not even really aware of.
Exactly.
And it's something about your observations that can sort of illuminate those implicit elements.
Yeah.
So one thing that occurs to me, listening to your research and the discourse about refugees back in 2015, is how we're currently undergoing another sort of mass movement of refugees in Europe, namely those who are coming out of Ukraine at the moment. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if your research has anything to say about the current refugee situation, because as we know, like you described it, the 2015 refugee situation was described as a crisis. Now we're not hearing, at least I'm not hearing, that sort of crisis talk
Yeah.
at the moment, at least. So it raises questions about does race play a role? Is there something essentially different about the current wave, or not, maybe? So do you have
Yeah.
any opinions on that?
I think that race definitely does play a role, and I mean, it's undeniable. But I also wonder whether it's not too early yet to actually say anything meaningful about this comparison, because when I think back to the very beginning of my research in 2015, the dynamics were not so different from what's happening now with the Ukrainian refugees. So there was a huge wave of compassion from within Swiss society and actually all over Europe. So there's even a word for it in German called Willkommenskultur, so the welcome culture that grew out of this. And there were people greeting, welcoming refugees at the train stations, people taking refugees into their houses. So quite similar to what's happening now. But then pretty quickly there was this backlash that started it started with very small kind of rumors and stories. If I take the unaccompanied minors as an example, there were the rumors that actually they are not really children, they are not really under 18, they're just faking their age to gain access to kind of a better treatment within the asylum system. And so these rumors started to kind of spiral, and suddenly the mood changed. There was just a huge shift, a mood shift, a Stimmungswechsel, we say in German. And I mean, I hope that this doesn't happen with the Ukrainian refugees, but you can already start similar stories are starting to evolve about them. And also, when I think back to earlier waves of refugees, for example, from Kosovo or from Bosnia, similar dynamics happened, when people were first quite enthusiastically happy and then the mood shifts. And so I think it's still a little bit too early to really make a comparison that really makes sense at the moment.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, and this thinking about this when you're talking here is another point that you talk a lot about in the book, about the sort of the moral nature of the discourse around refugees, and this idea of deservingness.
Yeah.
And how this can flip, like what counts as a deserving refugee, or what counts as a sort of an undeserving refugee. What in your book you have to say about the notion of deservingness?
Yeah. So it plays a very important role. Deservingness and undeservingness, kind of, they go together. And this is also because of, if you look at the asylum landscape in Europe at large, there's like these hierarchies of deservingness and undeservingness that have evolved over the last decades. And it really has to do with a race to the bottom in the asylum system, where fewer and fewer people receive refugee status. And so it's created as a valuable good, which is only granted to the deserving people. But it can also be seen within a wider context or a wider moral economy, where deservingness also plays a role within countries where welfare systems are increasingly being hollowed out. And so because social welfare or other public goods like education become such scarce kind of goods, then obviously it creates hierarchies of who deserves more access to this than others. And so it is within this context that, of course, the unaccompanied minor is on the one hand a figure that is first of all described as very deserving compared to other refugees because of their vulnerability and their age. But then on the other hand, I could see in my research how this is being questioned constantly as well. And this could again be described through this term of inclusive exclusion. So you give young people the idea that they do receive kind of better or privileged treatment, but then when you look into it, there's actually often not so much behind it.
Okay, all right. Well, I think now we've used up our time, but it's been a very interesting conversation. Very interesting to find out more about this book, and
Thanks
good
so
luck
much.
with the book. I hope it sells well.